is a UNCG Pedagogical Poetry Society video, and I'm Beth. Today, we'll be talking about ballads. We'll start with a simple definition of ballad along with some history and traditions of the form before we move on to some examples and approaches to teaching it. I think it's important, whether you're doing a whole unit on ballads or just teaching a few of them, to spend some time briefly on the history and traditions of the form, because it really does help students work through the ways the poet might be replicating that tradition, modifying it to suit his or her needs, or rejecting it outright, which can lead to a good starting place for discussion. If students can compare and contrast what they've been told to expect with what is going on in the page in front of them, it just makes for an easy sort of foothold for getting into things. So the ballad originated in Europe in the late Middle Ages, as early as the 14th century, when traveling minstrels popularized the form. They were traditionally set to music and performed as entertainment. An 18th century definition of ballad was a song commonly sung up and down the streets. Ballads are narrative poems, which tell a story, and they use great economy in doing so. Every ballad is a short story in verse, so the poet doesn't have a lot of room to work with. So they rely on imagery rather than description. Common themes included love, tragedy, triumph, and politics. Traditional ballads are written in a meter called ballad meter or common meter, which consists of alternating lines of iambic tetrameter with lines of iambic trimeter. Ballads were traditionally influenced by the community or region they came from, and used the common or colloquial dialect of the people there. Most ballads are similar in structure, style, and diction, and are easy to remember. Also, many ballads feature a refrain, which is a line or stanza that repeats like a chorus in a song. The traditional or folk ballad is kind of an impersonal, bearing witness of something with universal application or significance. There's an emphasis on a particular event or situation in telling the story. Lyrical ballads often lose that impersonality and tell the story from the perspective of an individual or center the emotional core of a narrative. So the three main categories that can help us define the evolution of the ballad: folk ballads or traditional ballads. These existed as an oral or musical tradition before they were written down. For that reason, a lot of them don't have a known author and might have even been collectively written. They were primarily focused on stories of love and adventure, and they typically used the common meter. Lyrical ballads started to appear in the 18th century as a new variation on the folk ballad. They didn't always adhere to common meter, and they sort of told everyday stories, as opposed to their precursors who were concerned with epic adventure or great romance. Modern ballads are defined a lot more loosely as anything that tells a story. Many modern ballads don't adhere to the conventions of meter or rhyme scheme of traditional ballads. So in this second section of the video, I want to consider a few examples of ballad and offer some approaches to teaching this kind of poem. Starting a new unit on any period, movement, or genre, I like to list defining characteristics and features on the whiteboard in the first class, and then in each subsequent class, I'll have students name each feature as we recreate the list together. Because as ballads have taught us, repetition helps us remember. The students really do internalize these characteristics and are able to use them to immediately engage with individual poems, simply by recognizing the way they might be working or not working, what's there and what's not there. So as I have taken you through these characteristics already, let's move to a few examples of ballad poetry. The first one I want to consider is the Song of Wandering Aengus by W.B. Yeats. With a poet like this that makes a clear allusion to something, in this case the titular Aengus, I'll give some background on the subject and ask how the allusion might be working in the poem. Then you can shift to thinking about the features of traditional folk ballads and ask what's the same and what's different about this lyrical ballad. It's a good idea to start with a few student observations and then lead them to a few things you notice yourself. For example, here I would point out that the stanzaic structure is longer than the traditional balladic quatrain. But if you look closely, there is a colon or semicolon break mid-stanza in each verse, breaking it up into 2 sets of 4 lines, which seems like a nod to tradition. Sometimes I like to give students the easy stuff or the big thing in lecture rather than lead them there. But the most interesting discussions can come from what you yourself don't know or don't understand. So with this poem, I like to ask questions about the apples. What's going on with the apples? Of course, the apples themselves could be Edenic, so look for that to come up. But you can also look at the sun, moon references here and with the traditional masculine feminine connotations and explore that. You could also point out that the masculine sun and the feminine moon holds with the previous descriptions of the speaker and the girl. He's got a fire in his head and she starts life as a silver trout. You could also tell students how Yeats understood the sun and the moon in terms of the individual and the collective, respectively. Might we consider that a nod to the old anonymous ballad form and the new individual perspective? The other ambiguity I like to point out in this poem is the last stanza. He's looked for her his whole life, and it's left unresolved. He says that he will find out where she has gone, and there's a certainty there, in the face of plenty of evidence to the contrary, that I find so compelling. Does this certainty come from the expectation of some kind of hereafter, given that he's an old man now? Or is it just dogged resolve? The speaker doesn't seem tired, doesn't seem discouraged in this stanza. The tone is peaceful, even leisurely. The next ballad I want to consider is Annabel Lee by Edgar Allan Poe. Thinking of our conventions of this form, I think the beginning lines of this poem are particularly interesting. It was many and many a year ago, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. Kind of this bedtime story, fanciful, impersonal narration, right? It seems the poet is setting out to write a traditional folk ballad, but then the twist comes in the added couplet at the end of the stanza, the extra lines as well as their content signaling a shift to the individual and the new. The speaker knew this girl personally and is intensely invested in her story and what happened to her. So you could introduce the concept here of Poe's classic unreliable narrator. Thinking about this fake toward the traditional, you could move to the repetition and meter and suggest that it certainly works to make the poem easy to remember. There's actually kind of an earworm quality to it. But draw attention to the cyclic nature of the refrain. For Poe's speaker, the obsessive repetition suggests a mental fixation on the trauma of losing his love. I also like to ask students to think about both parts of the refrain, her name as well as Kingdom by the Sea. How does place seem to be bound up with her memory? Also, the structure and meter are clearly inspired by the traditional balladic form, but highly irregular and disorienting, and the rhyme scheme almost becomes hypnotic. Given these observations, you can ask students what all of this can tell us about the poem's attitude toward love. There's a kind of paranoid intensity here that subverts the traditional love poem. And students usually have a good time talking about the mad-making capacity of love and the haunted quality a place can take on after a breakup. So especially with an emotional form like this, I really like to give students something personal with poems, something that I have found meaningful or valuable myself. If there's something you like about a poem, be enthusiastic about it. With the Yeats, I would probably just reread the part that has stayed with me and come back to me over the years. Though I am old with wandering through hollow lands and hilly lands, I will find out where she has gone, and kiss her lips and take her hands. And I would just talk about how those lines are beautiful and how they come back to me now and then. With the Poe, I would talk about taking a ghost tour in Charleston where he was mentioned and rushing to find a copy of this poem afterward with just this general deliciously creepy feeling. That was just so much fun. If you can get the students to just take a piece of the poem with them, to form a personal attachment to a couplet or a line, it can be so meaningful when they think of it again years down the road. I just like to model for the students the specific ways that I've remembered poems over the years. Well, that is all I have for you today, and I hope you enjoyed learning about ballads with me. Please remember to like and subscribe and check out some of our other videos for more awesome tips on teaching poetry.